frameworks, I think, for thinking about evolution of things like linguistic categories. And the one I'm going to be working in and sort of telling you about a particular case study today is sort of the iterated learning or the learning-driven variety. So I just sort of want to briefly kind of touch on the way that I'm going to be talking about linguistic evolution today. And so basically, linguistic knowledge is transmitted in a population via interaction with other speakers in the population, right? This is something we can pretty much accept. And so even though there may be some sort of individual variation, which we do expect to see, there is sort of a homogeny at various levels of linguistic knowledge within the population. And so the interesting thing about language is that the observable data that we see is actually generated by an individual's linguistic knowledge. So there's this sort of indirect process where we're actually trying to figure out what the linguistic knowledge is by looking at the output of the linguistic knowledge, which is the observable data within the language. And so something that we've definitely discussed is that speakers adjust their linguistic knowledge based on the data that they encounter. So again, with my little cartoon here, you have, speaker number one has some kind of linguistic knowledge he uses to generate his spoken speech, and that then influences the knowledge indirectly or directly of other speakers in the population who then adjust their knowledge based on that interaction. And again, this is something that we've sort of talked about quite a bit in this workshop. And so the general way that I'm thinking about language change or linguistic evolution over time is simply that you have sort of these two big factors in population level change, which is first the information speakers are actually passing to each other, right, this spoken language to the subsequent generations. And also there's a big component where you have to worry about how that information is integrated into an individual's knowledge, right? That's sort of another crucial factor when you're talking about language change or linguistic evolution over time. And the idea is that something happens as a dependency between these two types of things such that you get, change being very apparent at the population level for the kinds of, various kinds of linguistic knowledge. And so something that I sort of want to mention about, at least my understanding of linguistic information, is that not all linguistic knowledge is created equal when it comes to how it's integrated into an individual's knowledge. And so the idea that I'm working with is that some knowledge can be altered throughout an individual's life. So a really good example of this is vocabulary or lexicon, where you have, you as a young speaker within the language, you're picking up your vocabulary initially, right? But you can also pick up vocabulary items and change your lexicon items throughout your lifetime. So this is not something that's really constrained to any particular time period within an individual's life. And this, I think, if you believe lots of linguists anyway, this is in contrast to other kinds of linguistic knowledge where it can only be learned really or changed in the early portion of an individual's lifetime. And this is generally thought to be sort of more abstract properties of language. You have word order rules is a very common one that's thought to be something acquired very early and therefore changeable in that early state and not really changeable by whatever information you're getting from people later on. It's not something you sort of wake up one day and say, I'm going to speak in a completely different word order. The idea is it's a little less alterable later on. And so I guess almost like an idealization that's been used is that it's really only alterable in the early learning portion of an individual's lifetime. And so again, that's the cartoon of the only alterable with the mother and her child. The child's really the one that's altering the knowledge at this point, and adult speakers in the population are not, right? So this is the generalization that goes with this kind of thinking. And so if you believe that, which some of us might not, right? Again, but did you want to say?
No, I just want to,
yeah.
I mean, it doesn't change. I think everybody agrees
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't change so much. But this is maybe because the linguistic structures themselves at that level don't change so much.
So when you say the linguistic structures at that level,
like word order,
mm-hmm.
But I know, for example, one of the differences between Flemish and Dutch
mm-hmm.
is in the position of the verb,
mm-hmm.
the main verb with respect to auxiliaries.
Mm-hmm.
So when people grow up, let's say in Holland,
mm-hmm.
they move, they will, even if they're 20, 30, 40 years old,
the surrounding environment.
Yeah. So I don't know what data,
Yeah.
if there's firm data actually to make the claim that it's impossible.
Yeah, no, and that's actually a really good point, because the particular case study that I'm going to be looking at later actually involves a fairly surface level sort of alteration of the data. And it's possible that this is something where you'd want to say, well, there is some adaptation possible throughout the learner's life period, maybe not as much as sort of the initial adjustment period, but there may be some later on. I guess the idea is that there are certain kinds of abstract order rules, for instance, that are not so easily alterable. They're not something that you can sort of say, okay, yes, the auxiliary verb and the main verb, I just swap them, like something that's more not so easily noticeable, sort of, and that would be hard to consciously alter unless, so you would have to, the idea is that those sorts of things would be more difficult to change, just because they're more difficult to notice, perhaps.
Are you introducing this as a assumption that's going to underlie your work, or as something that you wish to explain? This
particular idea is an assumption that the work is going to be based on, and it's something that, especially after sort of listening to the various discussions within this workshop, that I think probably can be relaxed. And so the interesting thing, I think, for me will be its ability to explain the sort of change that I'll be looking at. And so, yeah, so at the moment this is... Right, no, so, so this one is, if you believe this, is sort of, this is the assumption that it's working in, so it's a good point. But the idea is that if you believe that there is sort of at least this early period where a lot of change is possible, and that kind of stops to certain kinds of information, and you're looking at change to that particular kind of information over time, the idea is that the main sort of kind of linguistic information integration that's going to be important is the time during that early learning period, right? If you believe that that's the only time it can really make big changes, right? And so really, I'm going to spend a little bit of time worrying about how the individual learning process works, because in this sort of framework, that's what's really driving a lot of the change. So it matters a lot how information is integrated by young individuals within the population. And so really the sort of the picture of change is not that you have, in this case, sort of adult speakers or speakers from all ages within the population interacting with each other, but instead really you have more of the young learners being the promulgators of change within the population. So you have a young learner doing some kind of learning from the available information, then they grow up and they become the transmitters of the information. And it's sort of the iterated learning paradigm in this sense. And so that's the idea that I'll be working with for the work that we're going to talk about today. And so because of that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time worrying about the nature of individual language learning. And then I'm going to actually look at a particular case study of linguistic evolution that actually motivated most of the thought within this area and on this particular case study. And so to begin with, the nature of linguistic knowledge, again, we're going to be focusing on sort of this process right here, the transfer from the adult speakers or other speakers of the population to young members of the population. And so to spend a little bit of time on the nature of linguistic knowledge, there are, of course, many different kinds of information that you would want to transmit in your population, and some of them are sort of more transparently kind of extractable from the available data, and some are less so, I think, from what I've been able to sort of gauge of the types of information. So one of the types of information that you may wish to transmit is what are the contrastive sounds within your language, with the sounds that transmit meaning. So the fact that in Japanese, my name Lisa is pronounced Risa by a lot of people, the R versus L contrast is not meaningful in Japanese, but it is in English. And so you might wish to transmit what kinds of sounds are meaningful. And so what you're basically doing is a categorization or clustering sort of analysis over the data to figure out, where do I draw my boundaries? What are sort of the abstract categories I want to transmit to young speakers within the population? And you can do this all kinds of ways. But the idea is that this is something which is, it's a little more transparent from the data. You're clustering the available data into groups. It's not an easy task, but it's a little more transparent than some of the ones I'm going to talk about later. Another sort of more transparent task, I think, one of the kinds of knowledge you may wish to transmit, what are the words in your language? So you get a stream of sound, and this is a phonetically sort of transcribed speech. And as your job as a child, as a speaker of the language, is to transmit the information of what the words are, as a child to figure out what the words are. And so your job is to break this up, right, to sort of extract the various words. So this is a task, again, this is a kind of information you might wish to transmit. And it's something where you're taking the data and you're dividing it in a certain way. And in that sense, it's not an easy task, but it's something that's a little more transparently what you're supposed to do in order to generate the data that you want to sort of get from this, which is the words of the language. And so then you also have sort of mapping tasks. That's another kind of thing you might wish to transmit. So there are often in languages different kinds of endings or affixes that you might wish to attach to words to signify different kinds of meaning. And in English, the past tense is signaled by a fairly regular rule oftentimes. You have, I blinked today, I blinked yesterday, I confide today, I confided yesterday. So there's a bit of meaning carried in that suffix, in this case, on the word. But there are also irregular patterns, and so you have sort of this, I drink today, I drank yesterday, I think today, I thought yesterday. There are these different patterns that you have to sort of figure out in order to transmit the information of how do I signal the past tense. And again, it's not such an easy problem to figure out, but there is it's a mapping problem. How do I get from form A to form B, right? So these are sort of a class of problems where the data is very apparent, and what you have to do to generate the data that you want, in this case the categories, the words, or the mapping, is a little more transparent than the case I'm going to bring up next, which is the idea of complex systems within language. And if you hang out with linguists, they tell you that there are a lot of different sort of generative systems in language that you want to, and again, that's a kind of knowledge that you want to transmit from generation to generation. And sort of the reason that I'm calling this sort of less transparent is that what you get effectively is the output of the system. You get the word order rule, our syntax within the system. And what you're trying to figure out is what is the system that actually generated that observable data? What are the rules that are involved in this? And so, for instance, if you have the observable word order, subject, verb, object, so I like books, right? So subject before verb or verb before object. The idea is that it's not that you're just trying to generate like this particular word order. What you're interested in learning or figuring out sort of unconsciously is the system that speakers use to generate that output. And the idea is that there are a bunch of different systems that could do that. So figuring out the system is a little bit harder, a little bit less transparent of a problem than sort of a mapping problem or a categorization problem. And so the idea is that if this is the kind of information you're trying to transmit, then you can sort of see why it might be hard and why it might be subject to change. And so keeping that in mind, that's sort of a note about the information that we're going to be transmitting within syntactic change at the population level. But the individual learning framework, I said I was going to worry about individual learning, and here's where I worry about it. And so what I was thinking about was that, in any kind of individual learning scenario, language or anything else, you have sort of three basic components that you might choose to manipulate when, for instance, modeling this. And the first is what the hypothesis space of the learner is. So what, in this case, what rules might they be considering for the system? And there's some probability, say, assigned or some level of belief they have in these different rules. And then there's the data set that they're actually learning from, right? That's got to be what they're using to update their beliefs. And then there's the actual update procedure, wherein they take data, some portion of the data, hopefully a small amount if we're trying to simulate human learning, but they use that data to shift their beliefs in the population. And you can sort of sub in different pieces into this framework if you're interested in manipulating the individual learning model, right? And so since, again, what I'm going to be talking about is language evolution or linguistic evolution that's driven very strongly by this individual learning level, then that's where we're going to be sort of playing around with, is within that framework, what the hypotheses are, what the data is, and various update procedures if we want. And so now I'm going to get to sort of the meat of it, which is a particular case study of linguistic evolution. It's actually the one that motivated the sort of thinking about the individual learning, because the situation was you had this sort of particular language change, and we have some data from it, and you're like, well, how do we explain this particular rate of change, given what we know about sort of the population and the time period. How is this really happening? And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the details, some of the details that we have from that time period. It happens to involve Old English word order in a particular time period. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about how we thought about modeling individuals within the population and how the population itself was actually modeled. And then some issues in empirical grounding, some of which Parth and Nayogi actually brought up yesterday morning. So it's a sort of a similar worry in this case applied to a very specific data set to kind of see what we can generate from that data set. And then talk about, in this case, some of the interesting effects that we see when we have individual selective learning biases within individuals in the population, and the effect that you actually see from them on the trajectory of change within the population as a whole. So so Old English, first of all. The thing that we see in Old English in this case is a change to a very basic sort of surface word order rule. And this has to do with the relative order of objects and verbs with respect to each other. So you have sort of two choices, right? It's either object before the verb or verb before the object. There's not that many other options, right? But so in this case, what we see from the data is that there seems to be a bias in the population at one point in time to use object-verb order a lot. And then this switches fairly quickly in the period of historical linguistics. It's over a period of a couple of 100 years, which is not quick to us, but still fairly quick if you're thinking about population level change sometimes. And that switches to being strongly verb-object biased in sort of usage within the population. Just for reference, these are abbreviations I'm going to be using throughout: OV, object-verb, VO, verb-object. So just to keep that in mind, if I forget to say the full name, that's what I mean by it, so sorry in advance. But the idea is that basically you have individuals within this population that have some kind of underlying distribution between these two word orders, right? And this is kind of the knowledge that they're trying to transmit successfully to the next sort of speakers, or any speakers, right, within the population. And the idea is that, so they use this distribution to generate individual utterances, of course, that have a particular distribution. Some of them are verb-object, some of them are object-verb, because you can't have a single utterance that is sort of 30% verb-object. You have to pick one or the other when you generate it. Yes?
Just a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking at all clauses of all types, or just simple main clauses?
Yeah, I'll actually discuss that in just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, but no, good point, because it matters, right, and it turns out. But yeah, so hold that thought. But, so the interesting thing about this is, again, if we're thinking about this as transmission via the young learners within the population, the distribution that the individual learner is actually sort of using may be different from the one that the speaker is actually generating. And to think about why that would be, I want to go back again talking about sort of the nature of the linguistic knowledge that's being transmitted in this case. So, for instance, the speaker is going to generate an utterance, right? They're going to use, in this case, maybe an object-verb order to start out with, but there are movement rules that happen in addition, because this is part of a system, right, of generating the observable word order. So the output of this system, though it started with object-verb order, is in fact subject-verb-object, right? The output of the system is actually verb-object on the surface. And so the problem, or sort of the reason that you get some distortion, right, is that the learner has to interpret this utterance. So they could say, well, I have a subject-verb-object utterance. Is it object-verb or verb-object? What kind of rules could I sort of posit that would generate one or the other? So there's ambiguity here. And so the idea is that the utterances in the speaker's mind, so to speak, what I'm going to call the underlying distribution, that doesn't have any ambiguous data, because the speaker's using one order or the other when they're generating these things. But the learner, or the listener, right, some of the data are unambiguous, some of them don't have this kind of ambiguity, but some of them do. So how the learners interpret those ambiguous utterances is going to affect the distribution they actually learn from, the one that they're presumably going to internalize at the next step. So the basic idea is the reason that the distribution that the learner doesn't get is the same one as the speaker generated is because of the learner's interpretation bias in this case. right? However, whatever they're using to figure out what to do with those ambiguous data points, that is what is going to shift the distribution.
So
Oh, actually, one second, because Paul had his hand up first.
I'm not quite sure I understand. Is the ambiguity based on the movement assumption?
Yeah, well, it's based on the idea that the child's aware that there are things that move in the language, and this is something, the particular rule that they might be aware of at this point in time would be something where the verb moves to the second position, because the verb is often in the second position and just away from the object in these utterances. So they're like, why would it be there when the verb and object semantically are very correlated? And so the idea would be that they would realize that there are movement rules, and so they might have to account for an utterance. It might not just be what the surface order is.
Well, I would just like to point out that the non-linguists in the audience, that not all linguists believe that there are such things as movement.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. Okay, my apologies. Okay, I didn't realize that was controversial. So thank you for pointing that out. So I guess in this idea that the fact that this could be generated in a way where the surface order is not the underlying order was available.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, I will actually a couple slides later, but I can sort of sketch it. I mean, you kind of see it in modern German a bit, where you have like, I'm gonna give you the gloss rather than the German words, because I can't think of the German words off the top of my head. But so you have something like I, subject, like, verb, and this is the one that actually has the tense on it. Books, object, to read. So infinite verb without the tense on it. And so the idea is that the actual underlying, this is sort of very similar to the basic word order within German, where you have the object and in preceding the verb in this case. And what actually happened was that this tense verb began somewhere over here as part of the contiguous verb sort of complex, and then moved to the second phrasal position in order to generate the observable word order. Because in German you can also get I read books, where you have sort of a very similar case to the example I have on the slide, where you have subject, verb, object, and the idea is that because this tensed verb would presumably follow the same kind of rules as the tensed verb up there, then what's actually happening in this case is you have movement of the verb to that second position from the position it would normally have been found in if it wasn't a tensed verb. Is that kind of... Okay, so that's again, I guess that's an assumption that the linguists are making, but the idea that there's permutation available of this kind and the order that you see may not be the order you actually want.
Overall, we all agree there's a system there, right?
Right.
Exactly how to characterize it is the...
Yeah, it's true.
I suppose the challenging bit here.
No, it's true. And so it's and the child's job is to figure out what the system is. Apparently the linguist's job is still to figure out what the system is.
But the thing is that such cases as this, like I read books, for example, are really potentially blinding you to the fact that somehow there's this general tendency to put the verb at the end.
Right, which you see in sort of other kinds of sentences. Yeah, that's the idea anyway.
So,
Yeah.
I guess one thing is,
It really is, and there's another way to talk about it, which is that in all of these sentences, that the tense verb comes, that there's something topical that's to the left of the tense verb, and that's the second element. And then if there are verbal complements to the tense verb, they come at the end. And that's
It doesn't really capture the fact that the actual meaning element of the verb is out there at the end, right? It highlights, well, I don't want to. We better let it give her talk.
It put the emphasis on which verb is tensed, rather than which verb has the heaviest substantive meaning.
Okay.
So let's let her give her talk. I'll edit it out later.
No, yeah.
If I can, one
Yeah,
just a very
yeah,
quick question. So
sure.
given that you're assuming that this the phenomenon you switched before is about movement,
Right.
I get the impression you're not monolingual learning of the movement rules. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. It's a
Why is that?
right. It's sort of it's the abstract. Actually, I'll get when there's a part where I will sort of talk about where the movement rules come into play in terms of the learning of this phenomenon, because of course they seem to have an effect on how you would interpret the data, right? And so the idea is sort of the abstraction that Partha had mentioned yesterday, where if you're tracking the change of one particular parameter, so to speak, within the system, you can abstract away from the grammars that do and don't have other features. And so in this case, I'm going to spend some time talking about how you interpret the ambiguous data based on your knowledge or potential hypothesis of the movement rules. But yeah, no, that's very, very relevant in this case because they do interact. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's just a question for the facts. So
Yeah.
is it the case in the data that some speakers basically don't care or they use both?
Yeah, the individual usage and it's actually the idea that you have a probability distribution for the speaker is actually motivated by individual usage where they do use both. And I mean, there are biases within the individual. I don't remember correctly if there was any individual that was just sort of happy to use both like 50-50, but there is some usage of the other order type within an individual. Usually there's a bias for one, the general tendency within the population, but there is variable usage. That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
So the child will get also.
Yeah, the idea is that the child's actually looking to figure out what the probability distribution ought to be, is the idea. So basically the idea is that the data that we have available from this time period suggests that between sort of 1000 and 1150 AD, you have a population that's very biased to use the object-verb order. Individuals have a strong tendency to use that particular word order. And this actually sort of shifts somewhat dramatically, so to speak, by 1200, within a sort of a reasonably short amount of time, to being strongly verb-object biased. And so the idea was this, again, if you're thinking about this as the learners kind of being the force behind the change in this particular case, then the idea is that the young learners have to change their probability distribution the right amount at each point in time so that you get a build-up of probability change within the population at the right rate. And so basically, the way that this is going to happen has to do with how individuals, again, are sort of dealing with the available input, the fact that some of it's ambiguous and they have to figure out what to do with that. And the idea, and these particular interpretation biases are actually motivated in part by this phenomenon because the data has very interesting properties, which I'll mention in a bit. But the first one is to use only, or to learn from only data that's perceived kind of as really, really informative. And the second is a bias to use only data that is sort of more accessible, perhaps easier to process for something like that. But in this case, I'm going to sort of sketch what they are. The first one is sort of basically encapsulated as learn only from data perceived by the learner as unambiguous. So basically, this is a strategy that says, that ambiguous data, toss it, right? We're just not going to learn from that because it's too hard to figure out what it is. And so a bunch of linguists were thinking about this for a bit. And they said in this particular case, well, okay, what you're trying to do is identify object-verb or verb-object data. And basically, maybe what's going on is that the child has sort of partial knowledge of sort of rules that might be in play in the adult system. For instance, this verb second movement rule, maybe that's what they have. And so they're looking for certain patterns within the data that would sort of be immune, so to speak, from this particular interference factor. Pardon me, let me get a drink of water. So the particular patterns that they're looking for are, so the first thing you might think naturally to look for is the object next to the verb, right? You're like trying to figure out the verb and the object, go find where they're together and see what the distribution is. And so the problem is that if you think that there might be some kind of movement going on, then you have to be careful that the verb hasn't moved to whatever position you actually sort of see it in. And so the idea is that you're either looking for an object next to a verb, a tensed verb, where the tense verb isn't in the second position, because you're like, well, if it's in the second position, it might have moved there, and I have no idea where it came from then. Or if you do see the tense verb in the second position, there's still hope, because you could have an object next to some other part of the verbal complex. Like in this case, the sort of the non-finite verb to read in this sentence would be part of the verbal complex like to read. And so that kind of information would clue you in this particular interpretation of unambiguous data, that the verb kind of came from there. And so that's sort of the basic word order you should be using, that you should be learning from. And so these are the patterns within the data that these learners would be kind of using as highly informative and learning from. And so that's, again, that's an interpretation of how learners would identify useful data to learn from. But the idea is that maybe this is what will help explain the trajectory that we actually see. And the second one is an interpretation bias that has to do with again, it's motivation perhaps using data that is more accessible. But the idea is that sentences actually are often made up of more than one clause, where a clause is something that's like subject, verb, object. It's got sort of a complete sentence-like meaning contained within it. So in this sentence, Jack told his mother that the giant was easy to fool. There are sort of two clauses here. The first is Jack told his mother something, and that's sort of the main clause. And the second one is that the giant was easy to fool, and that's sort of the embedded clause. It's the thing that Jack told his mother. And the idea is that if you sort of think about these as degrees of embedding within sort of the main clause, the main clause is the main clause, so it has 0 degrees of embedding, so it's sort of degree 0 data is the terminology. And the embedded clause is embedded once. It has 1 level of embedding, so it's degree 1 data. And so the idea here is that, and this was actually an interpretation bias motivated by the data set for Old English, the idea is maybe what learners are doing is only learning from the data in the degree 0 clauses and actually ignoring the data that's available within the embedded clause. And this, again, seems like kind of a funny bias. You're like, well, why wouldn't you use all of the data? I mean, it's there, right? And so one of the things that I'm going to sort of play with later is what happens when you impose these biases and what happens when you take them away within the learning model, within the population model. And so, again, the point of these two biases is to sort of have this difference in the input set that the speakers of the population are generating and the actual intake set that the learners are using to learn from, to have a different distribution in that. So the idea is that you're getting change sort of at each time step due to the difference between the learners, sort of the distribution that the learners are learning from and the distribution that speakers are generating. Change in that distribution is the idea in this model. And so what we're hoping is that this kind of difference in distribution will be the right amount at each point in time so that you get the particular trajectory of change that we actually do see within the historical corpora. Okay. So that's sort of the description of the language change information. And I'm going to spend some time now talking a little bit about how the individuals within this model are instantiated.
Yeah. 1066 occurred right in the middle of that.
No,
it's talk about that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. Actually, I have some slides on that. No, it's a very common question, right? Because you're like, well, wait a minute, history, right? I mean, it turns out that you can, one of the things you can do is sort of model the influence of Scandinavian speakers coming in, or old French speakers coming in, and sort of the effects that they would have on a population if you just had like second language speakers, for instance, influencing the data pool. Just as a brief sort of just got a little point about that. It turns out that it could be possible to get the rate of change that we're seeing from sort of the right mix of, originally the Old Norse guys and sort of the Scandinavian second language speakers kind of all coming together. But it's very tricky because it would require sort of an exponentially increasing amount of like people coming into the population, or an exponentially increasing amount of sort of prestige for speaking one verb order over the other. Right. So there's, the problem with this data is that we can only go with sort of what we assume would be close to the vernacular speech. And there are some issues with sort of how much you want to believe that those are vernacular.
The corpus comes from transcriptions of vernacular
Yeah, well, they're trying. It comes from. It's actually a collection of all kinds of documents, and the ones that were used are the ones that were identified as being most likely to be representations of vernacular speech, because they're not Latin translations. They're not like, very high and mighty documents. They're like something that's meant to be transmitted to the people, like Bible passages or something like that, to get the stories across, or transcriptions of letters that were between people. So it's again, it's a mixed corpus, but we try as much as we can to sort of get the part that would be most representative of the vernacular speech, because of course it's the vernacular speech that we're trying to track, right? No, but it's a good point that this data set can be problematic because you don't actually know for sure that what you're seeing is what you're actually trying to get. No, that's true. But anyway, so in this case, the individual learning model is actually really simple. It's tracking, sort of one probability. What's the probability of using object-verb or verb-object order, right? And that's the thing it's trying to learn. And so basically, it's a value that ranges, the full probability range between 0 and 1. So if you have a value of 0.3, what that probability means is that 30% of the time, when you're going to generate an utterance unconsciously, you're picking the verb-object order. 70% of the time, you're picking the object-verb order. Again, this is actually a point I want to mention, just in case. This is not supposed to be something that you're consciously deciding. You don't sort of decide, I'm going to use object-verb order now. This is supposed to be more the representation of the input to your syntactic rule system. So this is what it's being drawn from, but it's not necessarily something you're consciously aware of or consciously choosing to choose one word order over the other one. But anyway, so initially, the learner doesn't have any particular bias for either word order, as you might expect. And the idea is that, again, data from other members of the population basically provide the input set to the younger learners, and it's going to be filtered through these two selective learning biases that we just mentioned, although, again, we can strip them away later on within the model. And the individual update function, the particular one that I chose for this model, was a form of Bayesian updating for the binomial distribution that was adapted for the particular purposes here. But again, it's not clear to me that the exact type of update function is important, so long as it has the properties of being sort of incremental in learning and probabilistic in nature. Because you want to basically be able to, for the most part, recapitulate the distribution within the intake. In this case, it turns out that the particular functions involve a couple of different parameters. The first one is the prior probability, which you might expect that this is based on. And in addition, it also involves these two parameters, n and c. And so n in this case represents sort of the amount of data within the learning period. It's the amount of change, so to speak, that's allowed to happen to the probability. And C, it's sort of, the intuition is that it represents the learner's confidence in the data point, but it's a free parameter within the model that's actually calibrated from trying to match the trajectory of the available data set.
Sorry, I'm a little confused about these two, because C seems to be something which is relevant for a particular data point, and N seems to be something which is relevant for an entire set.
Right. And so the idea is that N is not necessarily, it's sort of quantified in this model as, the number of data points that you get to sort of make your decision. But it's supposed to represent sort of the, the amount of change that's allowed to be made. So again, it's not something that is necessarily, it's not determined by the data. It's just something that's an inherent property of the learner. Yeah, effectively. Yeah, no, that's a good way to describe it. So in this case, it turns out I just happened to use the number 2,000 data points. If you mess with this number, it doesn't actually, if you make it higher, make it 10,000, make it 20,000, it doesn't really affect the results. Because again, the point of the update function is mostly to recapitulate the intake distribution that you see. And so the algorithm is fairly simple. It's you start with an initial verb-object order or verb-object probability, of 0.5, and then the learner encounters a data point from an average member of the population. This is an idealization, of course. Presumably, you would have input coming from people that are closer to you, perhaps, or any kind of social network sort of thing. But in this particular idealization, they're just getting a point from an average, data point from an average member of the population. And then if this data point sort of satisfies the selective learning biases of sort of being perceived by them as unambiguous, being perceived by them as with a degree 0 data point, then they get to learn from it. And they just use the update functions that I just talked about. And this is it. This is all they do until they've seen 2,000 of these sort of intake data points, at which point we think they probably, it seems they pretty much have the distribution within the intake down. And so the basic idea is what's going to determine kind of the final value is what the distribution is within the intake, right? In this case, in this world, it's the degree 0 unambiguous data distribution. And so basically what we can sort of determine the trend of what we expect to see if we look at the intake distributions at the various time periods that we have. And so at 1000 AD, if you look at the intake distribution, there's a 19.5% bias for the object-verb order. So like 20 out of every 100 data points that you see in the intake are going to bias you towards object-verb and not bias you away from it. And this drops from 1000 to 1150 AD to about 2.8%. And then it flips at 1200, as we might hope, to be actually verb-object biased. Because again, the trajectory that we're actually hoping to get is to be object-verb biased before 1150 AD and verb-object biased by 1200. So keeping that in mind, again, I can turn actually very quickly to the population level model. And so the age range of the population ranges from 0 to 60. This is an arbitrary range. Again, it turns out not to matter much as long as you don't make them like only 20-year-olds can survive in the population. As long as you have a reasonable age range, this is pretty constant. And then I tried to actually, as much as possible, use sort of the population data that I could find from this time period to get realistic estimations of sort of a population size and a population growth rate. So in this case, the size chosen was 18,000 population members. And initially, we start at, they have an average probability of using this verb-object data, which is estimated from the available corpora. And then every 2 years, the oldest members within the population die off, alas. And everybody else in the population ages 2 years. And then the new members of the population are born to fill out the population to sort of match the growth rate that we see in the historical data. And these new members learn, just exactly from the data from the rest of the population with their interpretation biases imposed, right? And so this continues until 1200 AD, where you have population sort of cycling. And the idea is that hopefully by 1200 AD, you're going to get a population that's biased to be verb-object in sort of the exact right amount that we see from the historical corpora. So, and this is where I sort of want to talk about some of the empirical grounding issues, some of which Partha mentioned yesterday. And the idea is that we sort of have these sort of 3 time periods. We have the initialization part at 1000 AD, and we have sort of this middle time period between 1000 and 1150, and sort of a target state at 1200 that we'd like to be at. And of course, we have data from the historical distributions, but the problem, of course, is that this is supposed to be at least a representation of the spoken data. And the problem with that is that some of it's ambiguous, right, between object-verb and verb-object order. We can't tell when we see a subject-verb-object order in a sentence. We can't tell which order that's actually supposed to be, right? So how do we estimate that? We don't want to just ignore it, right? And so the problem is basically a mapping problem. How do you decide which of these ambiguous data points were object-verb initially, sort of in the underlying distribution, and which ones were verb-object? And so to do this, you can sort of, this is in a glance at sort of the distributions we have available. So we have 2 available to us. We have the degree 0 distribution, which is the one in this case that kids have been learning from. But we also have the sort of the embedded clause distribution. And they actually look quite different, which was sort of the one of the original motivations for proposing a degree 0 bias in learning. The first has to do with how much of the distribution is ambiguous, how much of the data is ambiguous between these 2 orders. And if you look at the degree 0 distribution, it's actually kind of very ambiguous. In fact, a lot of it is sort of unknown whether it's object or verb-object.
For a degree 1 bias.
Right, no, actually, I'll show you what happens when we remove the degree 0 bias. But no, it's a good point. You're like, it's really good data. Why don't you use that? Right, no, good point. But right, so the degree 1 is like really less ambiguous. You're like, well, that's interesting. And then if you look at the advantage, you look at the distributions within this data, and you're like, well, look at this. I mean, the degree 1 data sort of magnifies the advantage that we see in the degree 0. And you're like, well, this, this is looking sort of really solid. It's much easier to estimate what the underlying distribution is if we look at the degree 1. So the idea is that if we assume that ambiguous data distorts the underlying distribution, because there's no way to know of the ambiguous data if it was sort of equally object, verb, and verb object, or if there was some kind of bias within it. And if we assume that the degree 1 distribution is less distorted than the degree 0, because it's got less ambiguous data, the advantage seems magnified, then what we can do, we have sort of a plan of action for what to do in sort of trying to derive this underlying distribution here. And it's basically to use the difference in distortion between the degree 0 and degree 1, which we can observe, and use that to estimate the difference in distortion between the degree 1 and the underlying.
There was distortion.
Yeah, so distortion is sort of, it's the fact that if you, again in this sort of cartoon picture, that if you calculate the probability of verb object in the degree 1, it's higher than the amount of verb object in degree 0. So in that sense, the degree 0 is sort of distorted from the underlying because it's taken away some of the verb object probability that belong there.
You're referring to the discrepancy between
Yeah.
D0 and D1 as distortion?
Yeah, it was I think it sort of intuitively it mapped that way for me. Maybe it's not the quite the correct term.
So
Yeah, if you.
can you explain that?
Yeah. In fact, I actually I have a set of sort of more detailed stepping through this, which we can talk about afterwards if you want. But basically, the idea is that you can sort of, if you were sort of to imagine that the degree 1 distribution was used to generate the degree 0 distribution, then you'd say, well, okay, we know here how much verb object data became ambiguous. Of the ambiguous data that we see, we can sort of estimate the proportions of object, verb, and verb object that belonged in the degree 1. And so there's a ratio sort of inherent there, right, between object, verb, and verb object. And so an assumption that you could make is to say, well, let's assume the ratio of object and verb object is the same, right, if in terms of generating the degree 1 from the underlying. And that way we can sort of get an estimate for what the degree 1 is supposed to be. So, is that okay? Yeah.
This is again an empirical question. So for degree 1, the verb objects get longer.
In the sense of the.
So there was no difference in the distribution.
No, the distributions in the degree 1, the object-verb bias was kept. It was more strongly, but it did change at sort of the same time. So at 1200, it was verb-object biased and not object-verb biased.
It's interesting because in Dutch, which is very close to English, right?
Yeah.
Until today, it kept the other.
Mm-hmm.
So the verb is still at the end, whereas in the main clause,
Right.
is the second position.
Right. No, that's actually, again, some of the motivations for considering the movement rules. The idea being that there was a common word order between the two, and that in the case where you get a different word order in the main clause, that it's because of a movement rule. It's sort of part of the motivation for it. But again, it's I actually want, given the sort of the time constraints, if we could kind of keep the discussions of the linguistic assumptions anyway until the end. Just because I realize that there's a lot of assumptions this is founded on, to be honest. And it's just, I want to kind of see what we can do within this. So I apologize, but I just kind of want to keep that going. But this is sort of the more, this is the particular equations that derive from this, but basically it's exactly what I said. You have known quantities, you can observe derived quantities based on these assumptions, and then you can get a value, right, at each time period for what the probability distribution is. And if you do that, then you end up with these values of, these are the kind of values you're trying to match at each point in time in the historical trajectory. So you want object-verb biased of this value at 1,000, and an average of this value between 1,000 and 1,150, and you want it to be this value by 1,200. So you have the shift from being sort of object-verb biased to verb-object biased. Again, these numbers are measuring sort of the bias of verb-object. So they're low when you have an object-verb bias, high when you have a verb-object bias. And there's initialization period within the model. Everyone starts at 1000 AD with sort of an average value distributed throughout the population of that number. And then from between 1000 and 1150, this is where the calibration of that one free parameter happens. The idea is that your population, whatever they do, they're going to have to match, they're going to have to remain object-verb biased. So the value for C in this case is determined by whatever one will make them remain object-verb biased throughout that time period. It turns out to vary between 3 and 5 on the integer number line. It's not very variable, but just the idea that you want them to remain object-verb biased at this point. And then by 1200, you want them to become verb-object biased. So that's sort of your target state. And so this is what happens when we impose the learning biases, whether or not we think they're good learning biases. This is what happens of the trajectory of the population when we impose them. You start with a population that's object-verb biased. They're able to maintain an object-verb bias, an average value of 31%. And then by 1200, they've become verb-object biased. And so this is what happens when you have the biases at the individual learning level. And so, some reasonable questions that came up is, well, some of them seem kind of funny biases to have. What happens if you remove them? And so one way you might remove them is to say, so that sort of bias to use only the unambiguous data patterns, right? Well, why that seems kind of silly. It seems like you might at least make a reasonable guess about what to do with some of the ambiguous data patterns. And so let's, we'll worry about the degree 0, degree 1 in a minute, but let's look within the degree 0 and say, let's use sort of all the unambiguous and ambiguous data that we have available. So the question is, what do you do when you have ambiguous data? And the idea is maybe you just do a simple interpretation. The surface order is the order you want, right? Don't worry about movement rules. That's just what it is. Fine. So if you do that, then of course, again, we're trying to get this trajectory of object-verb bias before 1150. And so that means that since this is a learning-driven model, the distribution in the learner's intake is really, really important. It's what drives the eventual trajectory that we see. And so if you look at the distribution within all of the degree 0 data now, both the unambiguous and the ambiguous, it's a negative object-verb bias. You have a really strong bias for the verb-object data because of the way that you're sort of simply interpreting the surface order. So the idea is that if you remove that sort of unambiguous data bias, then you end up with a population that has a very strong verb-object bias in their data. They learn to be very strongly verb-object biased, and they learn it very quickly, right? So this is not going to be conducive to maintaining the object-verb bias before 1150. So you're like, okay, well, that's one bias. But what about the other one, right? Because the degree 1 data seemed like really good data to learn from. And sort of the idea behind that is, you're right. There's a really strong advantage, so to speak, for the right orderings. It's really strongly object-verb biased before 1150, really strong verb-object bias after. And so the idea is that actually it may be a little too strong in order to get change at the right rate, because you do need to change to become verb-object biased. So if you really strongly learn object-verb, maybe it's a little too hard to change so quickly to verb-object. And so
based on counting both degree 0 and degree 1?
No, yeah, the degree 0 and degree 1, but only the quote-unquote unambiguous data patterns.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll remove both in the next step, but excuse me. So what happens here is, so you want to ask, well, okay, we can model different amounts of degree 1 data within the population. We can say an input's made of 0%, that's like all degree 0, or 1, or 2, or 4, you can do a whole bunch. And it turns out if you want to get a population that can be verb-object biased enough by 1200, which is, again, sort of that 75% mark from these estimates, it turns out there's this, you sort of have this boundary of how much degree 1 data can actually be part of the input between about 2 and 4%, closer to 2.
But the concern is whether it reaches that point at the right time.
Right.
That is the concern.
Yeah.
One of your free parameters is effectively learning, right?
I mean, it is, but the sort of the control for that, so to speak, is the fact that whatever you do to it, it has to maintain the object-verb bias at the 2 checkpoints between when that. Yeah, and so it's like if you can maintain, if a population can maintain it, then can it change fast enough? Is basically the question in this case. Yeah, no, so, and so in this case, you're like, okay, so the border, so to speak, of permissible degree 1 data is this really low amount, right, because it's got such a strong object-verb bias early on, and if you sort of look at, well, how much do we think was kind of available to kids, right, you can try estimating this from modern English child-directed speech and say, well, how much of their input is made up of degree 1 data? It turns out it's like around 16% of it are these embedded clauses to like really young kids, like about 8 months or to 16 months. And if you have 16% degree 1 data in your population, you don't have this degree 0 bias, you actually get change that's too slow. You can maintain object-verb bias. You can really maintain object-verb bias. You maintain it so much, you don't change to verb-object. And so in this case, we get that change is too slow, which is sort of the opposite pattern we saw before, where change was too fast. And so you might reasonably ask, well, why don't we drop both, right? Because then maybe this will balance, right? And so you can do that. You can say, let's learn from like almost everything, right? We're going to learn actually from everything, from degree 0 and degree 1, from unambiguous and ambiguous. Just learn from it all. What do you get? And so the idea is that once again, we're looking at the bias in the learner's intake distribution at these time periods. And so if we sort of zoom in, for instance, on 1000 AD, then you have a bias in the degree 0 distribution that's actually very strongly verb-object. It's negative OV. And in degree 1, it's strongly object-verb, right? And so the idea is that to maintain an object-verb bias for like the next 150 years, you're going to need a distribution in the intake that's object-verb biased, right? And so, well, what kind of, how much degree 1 data do you need to have be part of your distribution to make this object-verb bias? The answer is, oops, there we go, quite a lot, 43%, right? You need to have almost half of it be degree 1 data in order for you to have an object-verb bias in your intake for your learners. And what we just saw is that doesn't seem to be what we would expect children to actually be exposed to. We would expect them to be exposed to more around 16% degree 1 data, which means you're going to have a verb-object bias early on in this distribution. You're going to have a population that once again changes too quickly in this case. So, I mean, this was, just sort of a, there we go, changes too fast. So, the idea, again, is this is a particular case study. It motivated a couple of individual learning constraints that we can play with within this framework because we have it defined. It's based on various kinds of linguistic assumptions and assumptions about learning. But in this case, we were able to sort of match the historical data we had available when we had some kinds of assumptions and not match it when we had other kinds, which is very interesting if you're trying to understand sort of the interplay between learning and change in this kind of scenario. And in this case, it turned out that these two selective learning biases were very useful in getting the right rate of change and having unambiguous data and degree 0 data being like the right set of data to learn from seemed to get us the right trajectory in ways when we removed them, they didn't, right? So this sort of is useful for understanding the interplay between learning and change in this case. And of course, as I said, we had a lot of different linguistic assumptions within this model. We had sort of a simplicity within the model where we didn't consider social network effects, which of course could change the distribution of intake. Maybe if the people around you, right, are giving you more data, this changes the kind of data that you might see. But maybe this is an effect that averages throughout the population. I don't know, but it's something that might be interesting to explore, sort of the effects of different kinds of social network groups within this sort of system. And there are sort of different kinds of, real world things that they could map to, like, how close the speaker is spatially to you, if they're socially related to you, these kinds of things that you could sort of explore within a model of this kind. And, another thing is that, for this kind of work, if we find other changes that we think are driven by individual learning or have reason to believe are strongly impacted by it, and we find, in this case, we found certain biases to be very helpful, we would, and we want them to generally be about learning, we would hope, or we could explore their effects on these other kinds of language changes to see if these are biases that are sort of necessary to get the sort of linguistic evolution that we see in other cases. That would be sort of the place to go with this kind of work, anyway. But sort of the larger take-home message, so to speak, is that in this case, we get correct population level behavior from correct individual level learning behavior. and we got to monkey around a little bit with some of the nature of the individual learning behavior. And the big point is that you have small discrepancies compounded over time in an exponentially growing population, and so small changes can have large effects, right? And so that's what we were manipulating here. And in the case study examined here, it turned out that these two sort of selective learning biases were really, really effective for getting the right kind of trajectory of change. And when we took them away, it didn't, right? So there are sort of other questions of what else might we do to get that right rate of change. But in this case, removing them didn't seem to be a good idea within this framework. And and the other thing that was sort of interesting, I think, about this particular study was that we in this case, we did have a lot of empirical information available to ground it. Like we were trying to sort of match an actual trajectory that we had data for, which makes it a little easier to sort of play with various parameters within the model, because you can constrain the behavior of your model by matching it to the available data that you have, which is something, unfortunately, that it doesn't seem to be available for a lot of different kinds of changes, but we do have some within the linguistic realm, sort of the data available. So I think it's very useful to also work within sort of the more empirically driven sort of changes and exploring behavior that way. But okay, I am done. Thank you. Yeah.
I want to go back to the Normans.
Yes.
And the question that Jay raised earlier. You have one account of a particular body of data.
Yeah.
And it seems that there's a sort of obvious other possible account for it.
Yeah.
If you look at the English prior to this change,
Right.
it looks a little bit like German, right? It looks
Right.
kind of like Mark Twain's mockery of
Right,
German
right.
translated word for word in English.
Right.
And you look at stuff afterwards, it's much more.
Yeah.
So why should I not think that fundamentally something like that is what's going on as an influence of a very well documented
Right.
major
Right.
invasion?
Right. I mean, so what you would expect. There's kind of sort of two thoughts that I have. I've been asked this question a lot, as you can imagine, right? I mean, so one of the things I was worrying about is within the model, you can sort of manipulate kind of the speaker's production of data based on sort of prestige, or if they're second language speakers that like that. And I mean, it turns out that, okay, so you can sort of try to isolate the causes of the change. So if you say, okay, well, Old Norse, right? That's sort of what caused the original verb-object bias, right? So let's look at that one. And if you look at that, it turns out that to get change driven just by that and not by this whole learning thing, you need an exponentially increasing number of Norse coming in, contributing to the data pool.
Given the assumptions of your model.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Only
no.
that
But that's Old Norse. He's on
Yeah, and
1066, which
yeah,
is next.
right. So there's
But I mean,
right. So the next one, right?
Yeah.
The next one, which is worrisome, right, is at 1066 you have this big invasion, right? And so all of a sudden you have all of this Old French kind of like coming in, and basically when I looked at the data of Old French to kind of see what impact this might have on the available data distribution, what I found was a reference that seemed to suggest that most of the embedded clauses were primarily object-verb. And so and again, if you're within a linguistic system that believes that the embedded clause order is more representative because it doesn't seem to have the movement rules that the main clause order does, then you would say, well, okay, so Old French is actually a predominantly object-verb system. So this would sort of retard the change. It wouldn't cause the change to verb-object per se unless you have an interaction between the Old Norse speakers bringing in the verb-object and the Old French speakers bringing in the object-verb, sort of.
But again, that's within, given the assumptions of your model.
Yeah, I mean, it's and unfortunately, it's actually based on sort of the interpretation of the linguistic data that's available. How you think that fits
So the news is that
into-
we're wrong in thinking that Old French is SVO, right? That's what you're telling us.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was able to find. I mean, maybe that's not
So
correct.
that's the
but-
one thing she's saying in response to this.
Yeah, well,
I have a totally different question.
Just say,
Oh.
It's your turn.
okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, and besides, I'm the boss.
Yeah.
I hereby call. There's another assumption, which I guess comes with the whole theoretical framework,
Yeah.
which is that the kids are even given that there is surface and underlying order,
Mhm.
that the kids are after the underlying order rather than the surface order.
No.
And why should that be?
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
it's,
that's just taken as given.
yeah, no, I mean, it's, the idea is that they're trying to match what they see to, to have an underlying order of their own. They're not, in this model, they're not necessarily trying I mean, they're trying to be able to communicate with, similarly with the other speakers of the population.
So they're assuming the whole panoply of movement rules and everything.
Well, in this case, they're sort of, I guess, being conservative learners in thinking that the orders that they see might not be the orders that they should learn. So in that case, you're right, in that they're worried.
Why should they think?
Well, I mean, it sort of goes along with if you believe that they're trying to learn a system that involves. Yeah.
With this particular kind of movement.
Well, I guess.
Because you could have systems that don't.
Can I offer assistance in this regard?
Sure.
So this was going to be my question, and it seems like it's relevant to the issue.
Mm-hmm.
So German sentences, have this bizarre feature of having these parts of the verb coming out there at the end of the sentence.
Right.
And if you're going to explain the occurrence of any such sentences in your language, you have to have some account of that, right? So when you get these sentences like "I like books," well, that's all fine and dandy, but occasionally you get these anomalous things where, which would be anomalous if you thought the word order was
verb object.
Yeah, and so that's essentially what I think this whole thing hinges on, is that there's this sort of fraction of such data in the corpus that somehow has to be explained by the system that you have, right?
Yeah.
And even if we just say, well, we're paying attention to surface order, there has to be some set of cues that gets used to characterize the situations in which those kinds of things will occur.
Right.
And so, so there are other approaches to this that I just thought it would be interesting to put on the table and see if you've ever thought about them. They have to do with the notion of conflict validity of cues. So you can have this comes from the work of Bates and McQuinney.
Okay.
And so they have this notion that some kinds of cues are available a lot, but they're not necessarily terribly valid, and some kinds of cues are very valid, but they're not necessarily available all the time.
Okay. Yeah.
And then there's situations where cues come into conflict. And when you have that cue conflict situation, it's the cue that turns out to be valid under conflict situations that you really ultimately have to learn to pay attention to.
Okay.
So,
So the cue in conflict.
I haven't worked out my full theory of how that explains the data here, but I just thought it might be useful to entertain that notion that somehow thinking about things in those terms might be another way of beginning to get a grip on how these things work.
One more question.
It would be consistent with your whole philosophy, I think, too.
No, this is just,
Yeah, one more question.
well, I have some, but
Me too, but it doesn't count. Me either.
no, I was just trying to clarify the example because basically, if you say it's a funny kind of thing, I don't think so because it's like in English, I like books for reading. Okay, zum lesen. So zum, that's what I suppose your example is like a preposition here. It wouldn't be really.
Oh no! Actually, this was at least the interpretation was meant. I like to read books rather than I like books for reading for the purpose. So yeah. So it's
the rampancy of ambiguity here is even greater than you've suggested though, in all kinds of ways.
No,
like,
it's absolutely.
like what's the subject is even an issue, right?
Right. Okay.